padlock broke before the door moved. Walter Hayes pulled again. Nothing. 69 years old and nearly 50 of them spent repairing farm machinery had taught him not to fight steel when leverage could do the work. He wedged a pry bar beneath the bottom rail and lifted. The door groaned. Rust broke loose. Then, inch by inch, it opened. A strip of daylight entered a machine shed that had been dark for years. Dust floated through the beam. Walter stepped inside. The place smelled of old oil, dry wood, and mice. Machines filled almost every wall. A small gasoline engine sat directly on the dirt floor, its cylinder head orange with rust. Beside it was an old pump with the carburetor missing. 2 transmissions lay beneath a workbench. Belts hung from nails hardened into permanent curves. Nothing looked valuable. More importantly, nothing looked protected. Walter shined his flashlight across the shed. Open exhaust ports, missing spark plugs, uncovered carburetor openings, oil pans resting directly against damp soil. This wasn't storage. It was where machines had been placed when nobody cared what happened next. The new property owner, Daniel, stood at the doorway. "Scrap man says he'll take most of it by weight." Walter nodded. "That sounds about right. See anything worth keeping?" "Not yet." Walter continued deeper. He wasn't looking for shiny metal. In a place like this, shiny metal could mean someone had simply removed a part recently. He was looking for patterns. What had been removed? What had been left open? Where had water entered? Which machines had slowly become parts donors for the others? Then his flashlight reached the back wall. Walter stopped. There was another engine, large, heavy, covered in dust so thick that the top had turned almost gray. But it wasn't on the floor. It sat on a wooden stand. Walter moved closer. The stand had begun to rot at one corner, yet someone had built it specifically to keep the engine several inches above the ground. Daniel followed him. "That one any good?" Walter didn't answer. He examined the intake, covered, then the exhaust opening, plugged. Spark plugs were still installed. A fitting that could have been left open had been capped. Walter wiped a finger across the side of the block. Underneath the dust was old grease and faded paint. He crouched. The drain plug was still there. Nothing obvious had been scavenged from the engine. That was unusual. Walter looked across the shed again. One engine had been stripped, another had filled with water, a third was missing enough pieces that identifying its original application would take work. But this one? Someone had taken precautions. Not sophisticated precautions, not museum storage, but deliberate ones. Daniel kicked lightly at the wooden stand. Maybe they just didn't want it sitting in the mud. Walter pointed toward another engine 10 feet away. They didn't mind that one sitting in it. Daniel became quiet. Walter shined the light behind the engine. A metal tag was attached to the block, almost completely buried beneath hardened oil and dirt. He rubbed it with his thumb. Nothing. He used a rag. A few characters appeared. Not enough. Daniel leaned closer. "What is it? Don't know, rare, don't know, worth money?" Walter looked at him. "You're 3 questions ahead." He returned to the engine. There was something else. A thin film remained on part of an exposed metal surface where Walter expected heavy oxidation. He touched it. Old oil. Someone hadn't merely removed this engine and forgotten it. At some point somebody had prepared it to sit. Walter's eyes moved over the plugs again, the caps, the stand, protected openings. Each detail meant very little alone. Together they bothered him. Daniel folded his arms. Why would somebody protect an engine and then leave it here for decades? Walter stood. That was finally the right question. If the engine had failed catastrophically, farmers usually didn't waste time preparing it carefully for storage. They stripped useful parts, pushed it aside, used it for scrap. But someone had treated this one as though it still had a future. Walter picked up a small scraper and returned to the identification tag. Slowly he removed the hardened grime. More characters appeared. Then a serial number. Below it, barely visible beneath the dirt, was something Walter hadn't expected. A second marking, not factory stamped, handwritten, faded almost beyond recognition. Walter brought the flashlight closer. Daniel tried to read it over his shoulder. "What does that say?" Walter stared at the marking, then at the protected engine. He didn't answer. Not yet. Because whatever this engine was, Walter now knew one thing. Every other machine in the shed had been left there to die. This one had been put there to wait. Walter didn't touch the engine on the wooden stand the next morning. Instead he walked past it. Daniel followed him. "I thought that was the one we cared about." "It is." Walter stopped beside an engine, sitting directly on the dirt. "That's why I'm looking at these first." Daniel frowned. Walter aimed his flashlight into an empty spark plug hole. "I need to know what 40 years in this shed normally does to an engine." The answer was ugly. The 2 spark plugs were missing. The carburetor was gone. Its intake had been open long enough for moisture and dirt to enter freely. Walter shined the light deeper. Orange corrosion covered everything he could see. He pulled the dipstick. Thick sludge clung to the end. "Dead?" Daniel asked.
"Abandoned."
Walter moved to the second engine. Its exhaust opening had never been covered. A side plate was missing. Several bolts had been scavenged. One fitting had been removed and never replaced. Water hadn't needed to break into this engine. Someone had left the doors open. The third was worse. Its oil pan had rested against damp soil until corrosion ate through one corner. Walter pushed a screwdriver gently against the metal. It went through. Daniel stared at the hole. Okay, that one's dead. Walter stood. Now look at the other one. They crossed the shed. The difference was immediate. The strange engine wasn't clean, it wasn't preserved like a collector's piece. Dust covered the block, rust marked exposed hardware. Grease had hardened around the lower casting. But it was complete, and more importantly, someone had controlled where the environment could reach it. Walter removed the intake cap. It resisted after decades in place. Underneath, the metal was dirty, not destroyed. The exhaust opening was plugged. Spark plugs remained installed. Unused fittings had been capped. The engine sat several inches above the damp ground on a purpose-built wooden stand. Daniel looked back toward the ruined engines. So whoever stored this one knew what they were doing. Walter shook his head. We know they cared what happened to it. That was all the evidence supported. He removed one spark plug. The threads came out dry, some discoloration, light corrosion, but nothing like the engine 10 feet away. Walter shined his flashlight into the cylinder. No standing water, no obvious wall of heavy rust. Then he pulled the dipstick. Black oil. It was old enough that Daniel made a face. Walter rubbed a drop between his fingers. What are you looking for? Anything that changes the story. No obvious water layer appeared on the stick. No immediate sign that the crankcase had spent years full of rainwater. Again, not proof of a healthy engine. Just another deliberate barrier between the inside of this engine and the shed around it. Walter stepped back. He counted them silently. Stand. Intake cap, exhaust plug, spark plugs installed. Fittings closed, oil left inside, nothing sophisticated. That was what bothered him. Someone had spent perhaps 20 minutes protecting this engine. 20 minutes before walking away for decades. Why protect it at all? Daniel crouched beside the identification plate. You going to clean this? Walter nodded. This time he used solvent and a rag. Slowly the grime surrendered. Manufacturer, model designation, serial number. Daniel pulled out his phone. I'll look it up. Walter covered the plate with his hand. No. Daniel stared at him. You don't want to know what it is? I know what it is. What it's worth then. Walter looked around the shed. Value doesn't explain any of this. He pointed toward the engine with the rusted-through pan. If your phone says this one's worth $10,000, does that close the hole somebody left open? Daniel said nothing. Walter returned to the plate. Below the factory information was the second marking he'd noticed yesterday. Not stamped, written by hand, faded almost into the block. He cleaned it carefully. A few characters emerged. Then a number. Then 3 letters. STD. Daniel leaned closer. What's that mean? Walter didn't answer. Not because he knew. Because 3 letters without context could mean too many things. Then another mark appeared. A date. Walter stopped. The engine was older than the date. Much older. This wasn't manufacturing information. Somebody had written it later. Daniel pointed. Repair date? Maybe. Walter brought the flashlight closer. That's when he noticed the bolts. Around one major component, the grime pattern wasn't continuous. The bolt heads carried old wrench marks. He checked another. Same thing, then another. These parts had been removed. Not recently. Before the dust settled. Before the engine spent decades on this stand. Walter moved lower. More tool evidence. Daniel looked from the handwritten date to the fasteners. Somebody worked on it. Yeah, then stored it. Walter didn't respond. That sequence was more important than anything they'd found yesterday. The other engines had been used, then abandoned, then stripped by time and people. This one appeared to have been worked on, closed up, protected, and deliberately set aside. Daniel finally asked the question Walter had been moving toward all morning. If it was worn out, why repair it before storing it? Walter looked at the engine, then at the ruined machine surrounding it. He loosened the spark plug he'd removed, reinstalled it, and covered the intake again. Daniel frowned. You're closing it back up? For now, aren't you going to see if it turns? Walter shook his head. Yesterday, the mystery had been why one engine survived differently from everything else in the shed. Now that question was too small. Walter pointed toward the faded date. Before we find out whether it still turns. He looked at the old wrench marks. If I want to know why somebody worked on it like they expected it to run again. Because the engine hadn't simply been protected from dying. Someone may have protected it after trying to give it a second life. Daniel came back carrying a battery. Walter saw it before Daniel reached the engine. No, Daniel stopped. I haven't even hooked it up. Good. You said somebody may have rebuilt this thing. I said somebody worked on it. Walter pointed at the battery. Those aren't the same thing. The engine had survived decades because someone had closed the easiest paths for water and dirt to enter. Walter wasn't about to reward that effort by forcing it to turn before knowing what was inside. He began with the remaining spark plugs. One by one they came out. Walter placed them on the bench in cylinder order. The first was dark but dry, the second similar, the third carried light surface corrosion around the exposed end. Nothing alarming, then the last plug came free. Walter held it beneath the light. Daniel leaned closer. Bad? Different. There was slightly more corrosion. Not enough to condemn the cylinder. enough to slow Walter down. He shined a light into the plug hole, then inspected the protected intake and exhaust passages again. No obvious evidence that the engine had spent years full of rainwater. That was encouraging, but Walter didn't call it good news. Next came the oil. The dipstick had shown lubricant remained inside, but Walter wanted to see what had settled beneath it. He loosened the drain plug carefully. The first fluid mattered most. If water had collected at the bottom of the pan, it could appear before the oil. Walter watched. A dark drop formed, then another. Black oil began flowing, old, heavy, dirty. But no immediate stream of water came first. Daniel smiled. So whoever stored it knew what they were doing. Walter watched the drain pan. They knew enough to close holes. That was all he was willing to give them. He replaced the drain plug after inspection and prepared the cylinders. A small amount of lubricant went into each one. Then Walter waited. Daniel looked toward the battery again. How long? As long as it takes. While the lubricant worked, Walter removed the valve cover. The gasket resisted after years compressed in place. Underneath, the valve train appeared coated with old oil rather than heavy red corrosion. Walter studied each component. Then he noticed the old tool evidence again. Fasteners had been disturbed. Certain surfaces had clearly been apart before the engine entered the shed. The handwritten marking from the previous day suddenly mattered more. Whatever had happened here hadn't been a casual repair, but Walter still needed the engine itself to tell him something. An hour later, he brought out a breaker bar. Daniel looked relieved. Finally, this isn't starting it. Walter fitted the tool to the crankshaft. Then what are we doing? Listening. With a wrench? Walter put pressure on the bar. Nothing happened. He stopped. Daniel's expression changed. Seized? Walter didn't answer. He applied pressure in the opposite direction. Nothing. Back again, this time. Movement. Bare perhaps a few degrees. Walter immediately stopped. Daniel stepped closer. It moved. Yeah, then it's free. No. Walter reversed it slightly. Then forward again. The crank moved farther. 10 degrees, then resistance. Walter stopped. He wasn't trying to win a contest against rust. With a starter motor, that resistance would be hidden behind torque and noise. By hand, he worked the crank backward. Forward each time, slightly farther. Then the resistance returned at almost the same point. Walter looked toward the open valve train. He turned again while watching the components move. One valve responded slower than the others. There. A clue. He lubricated it and continued working through a limited range, never forcing past the point where resistance became uncertain. Minutes passed. Then the crankshaft moved through half a revolution. Daniel held his breath. Walter continued. 3/4, resistance again. Stop, reverse. Forward, then, slowly, the breaker bar completed one full revolution. Daniel slapped the bench. There. Walter didn't celebrate. He rotated the crank again. The same tight area appeared, smaller now, but still there. Daniel pointed toward the engine. It turns, that's what we needed. Walter removed the breaker bar. No. He looked at the valve, then at the cylinders. We needed to know whether it could turn. He pointed toward the spot where resistance kept returning. Now we need to know why it doesn't want to. The engine was no longer frozen by decades of silence. But Walter had learned something more useful than whether it moved. Every revolution carried a message, and at the same point, one part of that message kept changing. Walter turned the crankshaft again. The resistance returned, same place. But weaker. Daniel pointed toward the valve train. Still that valve? Let's find out. Walter rotated backward, then forward. The reluctant valve rose more slowly than the others. He lubricated the stem again and worked it through its travel once, twice, then 10 times. Each cycle improved. Walter returned to the breaker bar. One revolution. The tight spot was almost gone. Another, smoother, a third. This time Walter stopped for a different reason. Daniel noticed resistance changed. Isn't that what we wanted? Yes. Walter removed the breaker bar. But that only tells us what 40 years of sitting did. He looked at the faded service date on the block. It doesn't tell us what somebody did before those 40 years started. That was the question now. Chapter 2 had shown him the outside evidence. Wrench marks, a handwritten date, the letters STD. Enough to know the engine had been worked on. A valve adjustment, head repair or gasket replacement could leave marks too. Walter needed something the outside couldn't tell him. He removed an inspection cover. Daniel brought the flashlight closer. Inside, the engine was dark with old lubricant. Walter rotated the crankshaft slowly. A connecting rod moved through the opening. Then part of the crankshaft came into view. Walter stopped. Hold the light there. Daniel did. Walter wiped a small accessible area. Under the old oil film, the metal looked used, but not destroyed. No obvious deep scoring, no broken fragment. The nothing suggesting the engine had been shoved into the shed immediately after tearing itself apart. Then Walter saw a mark, small, deliberate. He leaned closer. Daniel tried to follow his eyes. What is it? Walter rotated the crank a few degrees. The mark disappeared. He reversed it. There, numbers. Not cast into the component. Not a factory identification tag. A service marking. Daniel crouched. Somebody wrote inside it? Marked it. Why? Walter didn't answer yet. He moved to another accessible point, then another surface. The pattern was beginning to move deeper than anything they'd found outside. Walter wiped his hands and looked again at the handwritten notation on the block. STD. Yesterday those letters had been ambiguous. Now they had company, external service date, disturbed head fasteners, oil pan evidence, and a deliberate marking on an internal component. One clue could mislead. 4 clues pointing in the same direction were harder to ignore. Daniel said at first they rebuilt it. Walter shook his head. Not yet, Daniel laughed. What else do you need? Evidence. You're looking at it. I'm looking at evidence that somebody went inside. Walter pointed toward the engine. A rebuild is a bigger claim. That distinction mattered. He wasn't going to invent piston sizes or bearing work he couldn't physically prove. He could say something now that he couldn't say yesterday. This had not been a simple external repair. Someone had opened major parts of the engine. Walter examined the head area again, then the pan, then the internal access point. The sequence was becoming visible. The cylinder head had been removed. The lower engine had been opened. Internal components had been inspected or serviced. Then the engine had been reassembled, and after that, someone had capped the openings, left protective oil inside, and placed the entire engine on a wooden stand. Daniel looked around the shed. That's a lot of work just to leave it here. Walter nodded. That was the contradiction. The other engines told simple stories. They wore out. They were stripped. They were forgotten. This engine told a story that stopped halfway through. Somebody had spent money and labor going deep inside it. Then, instead of reinstalling it, they prepared it to wait. Walter walked to the rear of the engine. He cleaned one mounting surface, then another. Heavy wear remained where the engine had once been attached to something larger. He studied the flywheel housing. Daniel watched. What are you looking for now? The reason the work stopped. You think the engine can tell you? Maybe not. Walter looked around the shed. The machine it came out of might. Daniel glanced at the piles of rusted equipment. What machine? Walter didn't answer. That was the problem. If someone had gone this far into an engine, they hadn't done it for practice. A farmer didn't pay for internal engine work because he wanted a heavy block sitting on a wooden stand. He did it because something needed that engine back. Walter looked again at the internal service mark. For the first time he was reasonably certain of one thing. The old work hadn't stopped at the surface. Someone had gone inside this engine intending to give it more working years, and yet the engine had never left the stand. Walter replaced the inspection cover. Daniel frowned. That's it? For the engine. Walter picked up his flashlight and turned toward the piles of parts along the wall. Now we find what it was supposed to go back into, because the strongest clue Walter had found wasn't what somebody had repaired, it was what was missing after they repaired it. Walter came back the next morning with one goal. He wanted to know how deep the old work had gone, not whether someone had repaired the engine, how much of it they had repaired. He started with the cylinder head. The old tool marks around the fasteners were consistent. They weren't the random scars of someone struggling to remove one broken part. The head had been off. Walter moved lower. The oil pan bolts told the same story. Then the side covers. Several gasket edges were newer than the surfaces around them. Not new now, but clearly installed much later than the engine's original assembly. Daniel watched from across the bench. So they opened the whole thing? Enough of it. Walter removed an inspection cover. He rotated the crankshaft slowly by hand, while shining a light inside. Then he stopped. One bearing surface visible from the opening didn't show the kind of severe scoring he expected from an engine supposedly discarded after catastrophic failure. He turned the crank farther. Another surface came into view. Same thing, old, used, but not destroyed. That mattered. Walter moved to the cylinders. He couldn't fully judge their condition without deeper disassembly, and he wasn't going to tear the engine apart simply to satisfy curiosity. Instead, he looked for evidence that would justify the next step. He found it beneath decades of residue near the block, a second service marking, faint numbers. Walter cleaned around them carefully. Daniel leaned closer. What are those? Measurements. For what? That's what I'm trying to establish. Walter compared them with the earlier handwritten notation. He checked the components that had clearly been removed. Head, pan, internal access points. The pattern was becoming difficult to explain as ordinary maintenance. Daniel finally said it. Somebody rebuilt it. This time Walter didn't immediately disagree. He stared at the engine. Looks like somebody went through a lot of it. That was as far as he would go. A 40-year-old handwritten marking wasn't an invoice. Tool marks weren't a parts list. Without completely dismantling the engine, Walter couldn't claim every bearing, ring, or valve had been replaced. But he no longer needed to. Someone had invested serious labor in this engine shortly before it entered storage. Walter checked one more thing. He removed the oil filter. It fought him all the way. When it finally broke loose, Daniel laughed. Original? Walter wiped the outside. Beneath the grime was faded writing, a date. It matched the period of the other service marking, and beside it, a number. Daniel read it. Hours? Probably. The number was surprisingly low compared with what Walter expected from an engine old enough to look like this. But there was another possibility. Walter stared at the filter. That may not be total engine hours. What else? Could be hours when the work was done. Daniel looked back at the engine. Somebody rebuilt it, wrote everything down, put fresh oil in it, and stored it. Why? Walter didn't answer. Instead, he examined the mounting surfaces. The places where this engine had once connected to a larger machine carried old wear patterns. One mount had a distinctive bracket arrangement. The flywheel housing narrowed the possibilities further. Walter had spent nearly 50 years around farm equipment. He'd seen this configuration before. Not often, but enough. He walked toward the piles of parts along the opposite wall. Daniel followed. What are you looking for? The rest of it. The rest of the engine? Walter shook his head. Machine. They searched beneath shelves and behind an old grain auger. Walter found a heavy bracket wrong. Then another. Closer. Finally, beneath a collapsed wooden crate, he uncovered a cast mounting piece. He lifted it. Heavy grease still filled one recessed area. Walter carried it back to the engine, held it near the mounting point. The bolt pattern matched. Daniel's expression changed. So the machine's here? No. Walter looked around the shed. That was the problem. The bracket was here. Several related parts were here. The engine was here. But the machine that should have connected all of them was gone. Walter returned to the engine. Now the story looked stranger than before. Someone had removed a worn engine from a working machine. They had taken it apart, done substantial mechanical work, prepped it carefully, protected its openings, put it on a stand, and then the machine disappeared without it. Daniel stared at the matching bracket. Who rebuilds an engine and sells the machine? Walter looked toward the dark end of the shed. Somebody whose plans changed. He picked up the old filter with the faded date. The engine wasn't the mystery anymore. The missing machine was. Walter didn't search for the missing machine by name. Not yet. He searched for what it had left behind. A mounting bracket from beneath the crate sat beside the engine. Its bolt pattern matched, but Walter wanted more than one matching part before building a story around it. He returned to the back of the shed. Old belts, pulleys, hydraulic fittings, sections of linkage, parts that meant almost nothing individually. Daniel followed with a flashlight. You know what we're looking for? Something that belongs with that bracket. That narrows it down? No. Walter pushed aside a rusted pump. But it'll narrow it down when I see it. 20 minutes later, he found a heavy steel plate beneath a shelf. 4 mounting holes, a worn edge, old grease hardened around one side. Walter carried it to the engine. The spacings was right. More importantly, the wear pattern lined up with the housing. Daniel watched him position it. 2 matches. Walter nodded. Now he moved to the flywheel housing. Its shape told him the engine hadn't powered a simple stationary pump or generator. It had been connected to a drivetrain. Walter cleaned the casting until a number appeared. He wrote it down, then checked the pile again. Near the wall sat an old clutch component buried beneath a coil of chain. Walter lifted it. The friction surface was worn badly. Very badly. Daniel looked at it. That from our engine? Maybe from the machine. Walter compared dimensions and mounting evidence. Close enough to matter. Then he noticed chalk on one side, almost invisible. A short notation. Daniel wiped at it. Walter stopped him. Leave it. The writing was faded, but one word remained readable. Old. Walter stared at the clutch. If this component belonged to the same machine, someone hadn't simply removed an engine for routine maintenance. They had been working on the drivetrain too. He returned to the engine and studied the flywheel area. Suddenly the sequence became clearer. Engine out, clutch accessible, engine serviced, replacement or repair work prepared. Then everything stopped. Daniel pointed toward the empty space beside the wall. So what was it? Walter finally gave him an answer. Looks like it came out of a tractor. What kind? Walter named the family of machines the configuration suggested. He still wasn't ready to claim an exact model from incomplete evidence. Daniel looked around. There hasn't been a tractor in here since I bought the property. Walter knew. That was what bothered him. He walked toward an old cabinet near the office corner of the shed. Inside were grease tubes, broken gauges, bolts sorted into coffee cans, and paperwork. Most had been ruined by mice. Walter carefully separated what remained: parts receipts, fuel tickets, a bearing invoice. Daniel found an old photograph. He handed it over. A man stood beside a tractor in front of the same shed. Walter brought the photograph toward the doorway. The tractor's details were small, but the engine area and proportions were enough. Daniel looked between the photograph and the engine. It? Walter nodded slowly. That's our machine. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten year, several years before the service date on the engine. Now they had a machine, but they still didn't have an explanation. Daniel searched the papers faster. If the tractor was here, there should be something about selling it. Walter found the first useful receipt instead. Machine shop. The paper had faded almost white. Most of the description was unreadable, but the date matched the marking on the engine. Daniel pointed. So that proves the rebuild. Proves machine shop work. Walter continued reading what survived. The amount wasn't small. Someone had spent real money. Daniel found another piece of paper, a handwritten farm equipment list. Several machines had check marks beside them. One line named the tractor. Beside it was a single word, Solge. Walter checked the date, then checked the machine shop receipt. His expression changed. Daniel noticed. What? Walter placed the two papers side by side. The engine work came first. The tractor was sold afterward, but not years afterward, weeks. Daniel stared at the dates. That makes no sense. Walter looked toward the engine sitting safely on its wooden stand. Someone had paid to have major work done, prepared the engine to return. Then, before that return happened, sold the machine it belonged to. Walter had spent his life around farmers. They didn't usually throw away expensive repairs without a reason. Something had changed quickly. Money, health, the farm, or the machine itself. Daniel picked up the photograph. My grandfather might know. Walter looked at him. You said he worked here? As a teenager. The farm belonged to his uncle. Is he still around? Daniel nodded. Walter looked back at the engine. For 6 chapters the evidence had been metal. Tomorrow, for the first time, they could ask someone who remembered when that metal was still working. Daniel's grandfather remembered the engine immediately. He didn't remember the serial number. He didn't remember the machine shop bill. But when Daniel placed the old photograph on his kitchen table, the 86-year-old man pointed at the tractor, before Walter asked a question. Uncle Henry's. Walter sat across from him. What happened to it? The old man looked at the photograph. Which time? Walter glanced at Daniel. That was not the answer he'd expected. The engine was removed. That, he leaned back. Engine was tired. Broken? No. Seized? No. Thrown a rod?
The old man shook his head. Nothing exciting.
Walter smiled slightly. Those 2 words mattered. The tractor had become difficult to live with. It burned oil. Compression had fallen. Cold starts took longer. Under load it no longer pulled the way Henry remembered. So Henry made a decision farmers made when a machine was still valuable enough to justify the expense. He pulled the engine, sent major components to a machine shop, bought parts, and began preparing the tractor for another working life. Walter placed the faded receipt on the table. This, the old man squinted, probably was the engine finished? Oh yes, that changed the room. Daniel leaned forward. You're sure? I helped bring it back. Walter said nothing. The old man pointed toward the shed in the photograph. We put it on a stand. Henry coated things in oil. Plugged the openings, said we'd put it back in after haying. Walter thought about everything he'd found, the capped openings, oil film, protected cylinders, wouldn't stand, it all fit. Then why didn't you? The old man became quiet. The first time he looked away from the photograph. That summer went bad, not mechanically, financially. Feed costs rose. 2 pieces of equipment needed repairs almost together. Then Henry injured his hip. He couldn't do the heavy work he had planned. Neighboring farmer offered to buy the tractor as a roller. A complete tractor without the engine because he already had access to another power unit and needed the rest of the machine. Henry refused at first. Weeks passed. The repaired engine remained on its stand. The tractor occupied space. Bills kept arriving. Then the neighbor came back with cash. Henry sold it. Without the rebuilt engine? The old man nodded. Henry said he'd find another tractor for the engine. Did he? No. Why keep it? The old man gave Daniel a look that suggested the answer should have been obvious. Because he'd already paid to fix it. Walter looked down at the machine shop receipt. There it was, not a hidden prototype, a catastrophic failure, not a priceless engine somebody had secretly preserved, just an expensive piece of farm machinery caught on the wrong side of changing circumstances. The engine hadn't been abandoned because the repair failed. It had been repaired, and then lost the machine it was supposed to save. Walter asked one more question. Did it ever run after the machine shop work? The old man thought carefully. Not that I remember. Walter leaned forward. Not even once? Couldn't. It never went back in the tractor. The answer was bigger than Daniel realized. The engine sitting in the shed wasn't merely an old rebuilt engine. If the memory and paperwork were accurate, the internal work might have almost no operating time on it. But Walter immediately saw the danger in that thought. 40 years without working could damage things that 40 years of work never would. Rings could stick, valves could corrode, seals could harden, lubricant could deteriorate, condensation could attack surfaces nobody could see. A rebuild from decades ago was not automatically a rebuilt engine today. Daniel was thinking about something else. So we've got basically a fresh engine. Walter turned toward him. No, but he said it was repaired. Walter tapped the old receipt. Then it sat for decades. Those decades still counted. On the drive back, Daniel barely stopped talking. Walter mostly listened. When they entered the machine shed, the engine looked exactly as it had before. Dusty, greasy, forgotten. Its story had changed completely. Walter put his hand on the wooden stand. For days he'd assumed someone had protected the engine because they hoped to repair it later. He'd had the sequence backward. The repair came first. The abandonment came afterward. Daniel stood beside him. So what's the plan? Walter looked at the breaker bar, then the open valve train, then the old service markings. Now we stop caring what it was 40 years ago. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Walter picked up his flashlight. It meant the history had answered one mystery, now the engine had to answer another. Walter looked directly at the block. Somebody already saved this engine once. He ran his hand across decades of dust. Now we find out what 40 years of waiting did to their work. Walter replaced the machine shoppers. Then he erased one word from his notes. Rebuilt. Daniel noticed. Why'd you erase that? Walter wrote beneath it. Rebuilt. Decades ago. Because that's what we actually know. The distinction mattered. The engine may have entered the shed freshly repaired. It had not spent the decades since then frozen in time. Storage was its own kind of wear. Walter started with the cylinders. He rotated the crankshaft slowly by hand again. The tight spot they'd felt earlier had improved after lubricating the reluctant valve, but Walter wasn't satisfied. He wanted consistency, one revolution, then another. He stopped at the same position each time and compared resistance. Better, but not perfect. Next he examined the cylinder walls as far as access allowed. The protected openings had done their job surprisingly well, but they hadn't created a sealed environment. Temperature changed inside that shed every day. Cold nights, hot afternoons, humid summers, winter freezes. Metal repeatedly heated and cooled. Moisture only needed a small opportunity. Walter found light corrosion in places, not enough to explain why the engine had been rebuilt decades earlier. Enough to explain why it couldn't simply be treated as fresh today. Daniel looked into one cylinder. So the rebuild's ruined? Walter shook his head. Didn't say that. He moved to the valve train. The sticky valve was evidence of exactly the problem he feared. The engine had apparently entered storage with repaired components. Decades without movement allowed corrosion and old lubricant to create resistance that working machinery might never have developed. A running engine continuously spreads oil. Valves move, rings move, bearings receive lubrication. Heat drives moisture away. This engine had done none of those things. It had been protected from work and exposed to time. Walter drained the remaining old lubricant completely. At the bottom he inspected what had settled out. Sludge, some contamination, nothing immediately catastrophic. He cut open the old oil filter rather than throwing it away. Daniel watched closely. What are you looking for? Pieces of what? Anything I don't want to find. Bearing material. Little fragments. Evidence that the engine had suffered serious internal damage before storage. Walter spread the filter media beneath a bright light. Dirty old but no obvious handful of metallic destruction. That supported the story they'd been told. It did not prove the rebuild remained healthy. Next came seals and gaskets. Some had hardened. One showed evidence of seepage. Rubber components that had spent decades motionless couldn't be trusted simply because they looked intact. Walter wrote another list. Siles. Valves, seals, cooling passages. Then underneath, before Daniel stared at it, we're taking it apart again? No, then how do you know what's inside? We don't. Walter put down his pen. And that's where people get in trouble with old machines. There was always a point where inspection ended and testing began. The goal wasn't to eliminate every unknown. It could require rebuilding the engine a second time before learning whether the first rebuild had survived. The goal was to reduce the unknowns enough that the next test became reasonable. Walter serviced the lubrication system, freed what needed freeing, replaced what age had made obviously unreliable, inspected accessible cooling passages, then rotated the engine again. 1 revolution, 2, 3. The movement was becoming more uniform. Daniel smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. Walter nodded. They were. Then Daniel picked up a rag and wiped a section of the block. Beneath it, old paint appeared. You know what would make this thing look incredible? Walter already knew where the sentence was going. Don't clean the block, sandblast the covers, paint it, new decals if we can find them. Walter looked at the engine. Daniel saw decay. Walter saw evidence, the old tool marks, the handwritten service notation, the faded filter date. Grease somebody had deliberately left on exposed surfaces. Erase all of that and they could make the engine look younger. They couldn't make it healthier. Walter walked to the bench and wrote 5 words. Turn oil, compress, fire, load. Daniel read them. Where's paint? Walter handed him the dirty rag. Not on the engine's list. Tomorrow they would begin proving those 5 words in order. And until the engine passed them, Walter didn't care what color it was. Daniel arrived with a wire wheel in one hand and a can of engine paint in the other. Walter looked at both. Daniel stopped. You don't even know what I was going to say. Yes, I do. He pointed toward the paint, and the answer still no. The engine sat on its wooden stand exactly as they'd found it. Faded paint, dark grease around the lower block, rust on exposed hardware, handwritten service marks barely visible beneath decades of discoloration. To Daniel it looked unfinished. To Walter it looked honest. We're already fixing everything else, Daniel said. Why leave it looking abandoned? Walter walked to the workbench. 5 words remained from the previous day. Turn, oil, compress, fire, load. He tapped the first. It turned. Crankshaft could now complete repeated revolutions without the severe resistance they'd felt at the beginning. Not perfectly, not like a new engine, but consistently enough to continue. Walter put a check beside turn, then he pointed to oil. An engine that rotated after decades meant little if its first real movement happened without lubrication. Walter had serviced the old oil system, filled it with appropriate clean lubricant, and prepared to build pressure without allowing the engine to fire. Daniel watched as Walter connected what he needed for controlled cranking. No fuel, no why, because I don't want it starting. Daniel laughed. Most mechanics want engines to start, eventually. Walter cranked the engine briefly, then stopped. He checked. Nothing yet again. Short rotation. Stop. This time, oil appeared where Walter wanted it. He continued cautiously. Oil began reaching the upper engine. Walter watched the valve train. Lubricant spread across surfaces that had spent decades almost motionless. Only then did he put a check beside. Pression. Walter installed the gauge. Cylinder 1 built pressure. He recorded it. Cylinder 2, then 3. The numbers weren't identical. Walter wasn't expecting perfection from an engine that had spent decades sitting. Then came the final cylinder. Walter watched closely. Daniel leaned in. Well, Walter compared all 4 readings. The last cylinder was weaker, not dead, not zero, but different. Daniel's expression dropped. So the rebuild didn't survive. Walter shook his head. That's not what the gauge said. It's lower. Lower isn't a diagnosis. Walter added a small amount of oil and repeated the test. Number changed. Then he checked valve behavior again. The engine was forcing them to remember the same lesson it had taught from the beginning. Decades of storage could create problems that had nothing to do with the quality of the old rebuild. Walter wrote the readings down, didn't put a full check beside compress. Instead, acceptable for controlled start. Right check hot. That's a lot less exciting than a check marks, more useful. He reached for the old ignition components. Now the work became less visible. Connections, timing, spark, fuel delivery, cooling. Walter inspected each system for one purpose, not to make the engine perfect, to make the first start controlled. Daniel picked up the wire wheel again. At least let me clean the valve cover. Walter took it from him. No, why do you care so much about old paint?
Don't.
Walter pointed to the handwritten service notation. I care about that, then the old tool marks, and those, the faded date on the filter they'd removed. That too. Every scar helped tell the sequence they'd spent days reconstructing. Somebody had opened this engine, paid for machine work, reassembled it, protected it, then waited for a future that never came. A fresh coat of paint could make the engine look better. It could also erase the very clues that had made Walter stop beside it in the first place. Daniel looked at the block. So you're restoring it without restoring it. Walter shook his head. I'm testing it. That afternoon, list changed again. Turn pass, oil pass, compress, conditional pass, then fire still blank. Walter installed the spark plugs, prepared clean fuel, verified ignition, checked the cooling system one final time. Then Daniel brought over the battery. This time Walter didn't tell him to take it away. He connected the cables. For the first time in decades, the engine had electrical power available to its starter. Daniel looked at him. Ready? Walter stared at the old block. No. Daniel frowned. Walter reached for the ignition controls, but now the engine is. Tomorrow they would finally ask it to do something nobody could prove it had done since the day it came back from the machine shop. Fire. Walter did not turn the key immediately. The battery was connected. Clean fuel was ready. Fresh oil was circulating. The plugs were installed. For the first time in decades, there was nothing obvious preventing the engine from starting. That was exactly why Walter slowed down, walked around the stand one final time. Fuel connections, cooling system, oil level, loose tools. Anything that could become dangerous the moment vibration entered the equation. Daniel stood near the controls. You've checked that 3 times. Walter looked underneath the engine. 4th one's free. Then he reached for the ignition. Ready? Walter turned it on. Watch the engine, not me. He engaged the starter. The engine rotated. Walter released it. Silence. Daniel looked disappointed. Nothing. Walter was looking at the oil pressure gauge. Not nothing. Pressure had begun to register. That mattered more than noise from the exhaust. He waited, checked for leaks, then tried again. Nothing. Walter stopped. Daniel pointed toward the fuel system. More gas? No, you think it's not getting enough? I think guessing gets expensive. Walter checked spark first, present, then fuel delivery. Fuel was reaching the system. He examined the ignition timing. Something wasn't quite right. Old components had been disturbed decades earlier, and Walter had no proof anyone had completed the final setup after the engine returned from the machine shop. That possibility suddenly mattered. This engine may never have been prepared to run after the rebuild. Walter made a small correction, then stepped back. Again the starter turned. 2 revolutions, 3, then cough. Daniel's head snapped toward the engine. Walter released the starter immediately. You heard that? Walter nodded. The engine had fired once. That was evidence, not success. He checked underneath. Dry, oil pressure had responded. Nothing was overheating because nothing had run long enough yet. Walter waited several seconds. Then tried the starter rotated. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. For perhaps 2 seconds the entire stand shook beneath a rough, uneven rhythm. Then the engine died. Daniel laughed. It ran. Walter was already checking the engine, briefly. That's running. That's combustion. He pulled one plug, examined it, then another. One cylinder wasn't contributing the way Walter wanted. The weaker compression reading suddenly had context. But it was participating, that mattered. Walter adjusted the fuel mixture and rechecked ignition. Then he placed his hand near the controls. Third time. Daniel moved back. Walter engaged the starter. The engine turned, caught, then fired. This time it stayed running. A cloud of smoke pushed from the exhaust. Dust vibrated from the wooden stand. The engine hunted unevenly for several seconds before settling into a rough idle. Daniel grinned. Walter didn't. His eyes went immediately to the oil pressure gauge. Pressure. Good. Then the cooling system. Then the engine itself. He listened, not to the exhaust, past it. Bearing noise, valve train, knocks, clicks, anything that became louder as oil circulated and temperature began to rise. The engine had spent decades waiting for this moment. Walter wasn't going to destroy it, celebrating. 30 seconds. Oil pressure remained stable. A small seep appeared near an old gasket. Walter marked the location mentally. 45. He shut the engine off. Daniel stared at him. Why did you stop it? Walter stepped toward the engine. Because we learned what we needed. It was running. Exactly. Now Walter could inspect what heat, pressure, and vibration had revealed. He checked the oil, the cooling system, the small seep, connections. Then he removed the plugs again. The weaker cylinder still concerned him. Nothing from the first run demanded immediate surrender. Turn, pause for pause, compress, conditional pass. Walter picked up the chalk. Beside fire he wrote, pause, so that's it. Walter looked at the final word. No, running without resistance proved an engine could keep itself alive. It did not prove bearings would hold pressure hot. It didn't prove cooling would remain stable. It didn't prove the weak cylinder would contribute under demand. And it certainly didn't prove the old machine shop work had survived decades of storage well enough to make useful power. Walter put the chalk down. For 40 years, this engine had been protected because somebody believed it still had work left in it. Today it had finally fired. Tomorrow, Walter would find out whether that belief had been justified. Walter let the engine cool completely before touching it again. Daniel didn't understand why. It ran. Oil pressure was good. What are we waiting for? Walter pointed toward the engine. For it to stop being impressive. Daniel frowned. Walter had seen this mistake before. An engine that hadn't run in 40 years could fire for 30 seconds and make everyone forget the important question. Could it hold oil pressure hot? Could the cooling system control temperature? Would the weak cylinder improve, or get worse? Could it make power when something actually resisted it? Running in a shed answered none of those. The next morning Walter started it again. This time it fired sooner. The rough idle remained for several seconds, then gradually settled. Walter watched the oil pressure gauge. Cold pressure was strong, expected. He wrote the number down. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. As the oil warmed, pressure's bad. No, that's warm oil. How far can it drop? That's what we're finding out. Walter increased engine speed slightly. Pressure responded. Good. He returned it to idle. Still acceptable. Then he watched temperature. The cooling system. No violent bubbling. The small gasket seep from the first run remained manageable, but Walter marked it for repair. Then he shut the engine down. Daniel stared at him. Again? Now we test compression hot. Plugs came out. Cylinder 1, 2, 3, then the weaker cylinder. Walter watched the gauge climb. Daniel leaned closer. Number was better. Not identical to the others. But closer. Daniel smiled. So the rings freed up? Maybe. Valve sealing? Maybe. You ever just say something's good? Walter wrote down the reading. When it proves it, the engine had now proved it could start cold, reach operating temperature, maintain lubrication and restart warm. But the final word remained on the board, load. Walter couldn't reinstall the engine into the missing tractor, so he prepared a controlled test using equipment capable of applying resistance while monitoring the engine. Nothing dramatic. No maximum power stunt. No attempt to discover how close a 40-year-old rebuild could get to destruction. The first load was light. Walter brought the engine to operating speed. Then resistance increased. The exhaust note changed immediately. Daniel's smile disappeared. The first time the engine wasn't merely spinning itself. It was being asked to work. Walter watched the gauges. Oil pressure held. Temperature remained stable. RPM dipped then recovered. He listened carefully. No deep knock. No sudden mechanical hammering. No violent vibration. Walter increased the load slightly. The engine pulled harder. The wooden stand transmitted a low vibration through the floor. Daniel watched the gauge. It's holding. Walter said nothing. Another minute, then another. The weaker cylinder didn't disappear under load. The engine continued producing steady power. Walter reduced resistance, let it stabilize, then shut it down. The shed became silent again. Daniel looked at the board. You can check it now. He inspected the engine first. Oil, coolant, leaks, fasteners, Anything heat and load had exposed. Only after that did he pick up the chalk, torn pass, compress, pass, fire pass. Then the final line, load pa. Daniel looked at the old engine. So whoever rebuilt it knew what they were doing. Walter ran his hand across the faded block. The evidence supported that now. Someone decades earlier had machined, assembled, lubricated, and protected this engine well enough that after years of silence the core of their work remained. Time had stuck a valve, hardened seals, contaminated lubricant, created corrosion. It hadn't erased everything. Walter looked across the shed at the other engines. They had seemed identical on the first day. Old, dirty, forgotten. Now the difference was undeniable. The special engine wasn't the cleanest, it wasn't the newest. Walter still didn't care whether it was the most valuable. Daniel pointed toward the board. So we're finished? Walter looked at the engine. Testing it. He nodded. Daniel waited. Walter's eyes moved to the old wooden stand, the handwritten service mark, the remains of the grease someone had deliberately left there decades earlier. There was still one question left, not mechanical. Why had one man protected an engine for a future he never got to see? And Walter knew exactly where the engine needed to go to answer it. Walter didn't paint the engine. He didn't polish the valve cover. He didn't replace the faded identification plate, or remove the handwritten marks beneath it. When Daniel arrived the next morning, the engine looked almost exactly as it had on the day they opened the shed. Except now there was clean oil inside it, clean fuel feeding it, and 5 words on the board behind it: turn pass, oil pass, compress pass, fire pass, load pass. Daniel looked at the engine. So what happens to it now? Walter didn't answer immediately. He disconnected the test equipment and began preparing the engine for storage again. Daniel frowned. You're putting it back? Yeah, after all that? Walter looked toward the wooden stand. That's where its story is. They moved the engine back toward the rear of the shed. Not into the dark corner where they'd found it. Walter positioned it closer to the open doorway, where afternoon light reached the block. Then he began protecting it. He treated the openings carefully, checked the oil, covered what needed covering. Daniel watched. You're doing exactly what Henry did. Walter stopped. Daniel was right. Decades earlier, Henry had stood somewhere in this same shed with an engine that had just returned from machine work. He'd coated vulnerable surfaces, closed openings, placed the engine on a stand, and expected that protection to last only until he could put it back into his tractor. Maybe weeks, maybe a few months. Instead it lasted through changing farms, changing owners, winters, summers, and almost an entire working lifetime. Daniel walked around the engine. Still seems crazy. What does that nobody used it? Walter looked at the faded service date. That was the easy way to see the story. An engine rebuilt and then wasted. But Walter no longer thought that was what had happened. Henry hadn't known the tractor would be sold when he paid for the machine work. He hadn't known his injury would change his ability to farm. He hadn't known bills would force one decision ahead of another. And when the tractor disappeared, he hadn't thrown the engine away. He had preserved the possibility that it might matter again. Daniel pointed toward the block. What do you think it's worth? Walter smiled. You've been trying to ask me that since the first day. And you still haven't answered, because I still don't know. Daniel laughed. You've had it running under load. That tells me what it can do. Doesn't that tell you what it's worth? No. Walter looked across the shed. The other engines were still there, one with open cylinders, one missing its carburetor, another slowly rusting into the dirt. On the first day Daniel had seen a room full of old engines. Walter had seen the same thing, until small details changed the question. A wooden stand, covered openings, oil where corrosion should have been, old tool marks, a machine shop date. None had screamed for attention. That was why everyone else had missed them. Daniel touched the stand. So this one was different because it had been rebuilt. Walter shook his head. That's not the important difference. Then what was? Walter pointed toward the other engines. Those were put down when somebody was finished with them. Then he pointed toward this one. This was put down because somebody thought they'd need it again. That was the difference. The engine hadn't survived because it was rare. It hadn't survived because the shed was dry. The shed wasn't dry, and it certainly hadn't survived because 40 years of storage were harmless. Time had attacked it anyway. A valve had stuck, seals had hardened, lubricant had deteriorated. Corrosion had begun wherever protection wasn't perfect. What saved the engine was much simpler. Somebody had expected it to have a tomorrow. Walter reached for the starter controls one final time. The engine turned twice, then fired. Its idle settled faster now. Daniel stood beside the doorway as the sound filled the abandoned shed. For decades, that building had heard nothing but wind through broken boards and rain against the roof. Now one engine was running inside it again. Walter let it run briefly, then shut it down. Daniel looked at the silent engine. You know what's strange? What? Everybody would have assumed it survived because nobody used it. Walter wiped his hands. That sounded reasonable. It was also backward. Looked at the caps, the stand, and the traces of old grease left by a farmer who had expected to return. It didn't survive because nobody used it. Walter placed the cover over the engine. It survived because somebody expected to use it again.